So all of my training is in American analytic philosophy. Almost all of my research is in the history of biology. And I'm academically embedded in a department of biology. And so depending on kind of which hour of which day, I will probably be in one of those three worlds. And occasionally they intersect, but mostly they don't. So I teach evolutionary genetics and population genetics in the biology department. I do almost all of my research on history of evolution and history of genetics. And then I have this whole other sideline on philosophy, which is supposedly where I'm trained to do. And there I do a whole bunch of other stuff on causes and other aspects of science. So out of those three worlds, you notice none of them are really history of sexuality, none of them are women and gender studies. And so by now I imagine you've all figured out that I don't really come from a history of sexuality background. So let me just tell you exactly how I thought about this paper, because it's very idiosyncratic in the way I came to it. So Veronica found me, and Veronica suggested the idea of this institute. And what appealed to me wasn't the sexuality part. What appealed to me was the global part, because I've been worrying about global circulation of knowledge, especially in developmental biology in the post-war period. And so I have a big project that's trying to understand that as a global science. But the way that, and I do all this work on Richard Goldschmidt, and yeah, he does a bunch of stuff on sex, so I figured, oh, I can make these two things work together somehow. So I did a bunch of research and didn't really pull it all together until about 3 weeks ago when I started writing this paper. But the way I think about migration is probably not typical, and that's where I started. So when I start thinking about migration and the transfer of knowledge, the way I approached this was by building an analogy to mathematical models of migration in population genetics. So in population genetics, there's a basic model of how genes change over time that assumes that if nothing acts, everything stays the same. So it's an equilibrium model. And then what scientists did in the 30s and still do today is they look at how different kinds of things will systematically alter that equilibrium. And migration is one of the things that can have the biggest impact on the genetic constitution of a population over time. So usually when you think about impacts, evolutionary biologists will make a list of things that will increase variation in a population and things that will decrease variation in a population. Mutation, because it's actually changing the chemical constitution of a gene, increases variation in a population. Migration decreases variation in a population. The way it does that is you have to think about a population as divided into different subpopulations. Each of those subpopulations might be located in a particular geographic region. And they assume that they're isolated from each other. So that means that they're not exchanging lots of parties. And so that little subpopulation becomes adapted to its particular environment. And it might have certain kinds of gene combinations that allow it to do particularly well in that environment. Well, if you then start allowing migration to occur between these different locally adapted subpopulations, what will happen is that if you get enough migration, you'll get a lot of gene flow. Those genes will start to be spread. And after a little bit of time, you'll have what's a genetically homogeneous population. Okay? So migration is much more powerful than mutation. So to grasp that concept, mutation changes a single gene. If you have 25,000 genes, when you enter into a new population, you're basically 25,000 mutations. Okay? So it can have an incredible effect. Even a small rate of migration can create a lot, or can reduce diversity, reduce variability quite a bit. So that's my model of migration in the back of my head. Here's the analogy. First let's think about what's traveling. It's not genes that I'm interested in, right? So what travels in science? Well, it's ideas, methods, standards, material, people. Sometimes entire institutes travel. The New School for Social Research, the whole thing moved in mid-century. That's unusual, right? But usually, so one of the questions I'm interested in the paper as I approached it was, what travels and what travels fastest and easiest? And then how do those things become adapted to local circumstances? In population genetics, they don't ever worry about that adapting to local circumstances bit. They just assume that every migrant that comes into the population can have sex with anybody at once, and the genes are automatically sort of dumped in it. In fact, they eliminate organisms completely. And the model is just gene flow into isolated gene pools. That's the way they talk about it. So there's actually no organisms involved in it. But in science, that's not the case, right? So now you have to talk about, well, when a new idea comes in, or a new method, or a new standard, how does that get incorporated, or rejected, or modified in that new community? So as we start to think about that, you have to think about different kinds of entities that are within that community that make that easier or more difficult, right? And so so we can do this lots of different ways. There's nations, institutions, laboratories, individuals. One of the things that I focus particularly on is on practices, because during the 80s and 90s, when I was being trained as a graduate student, science studies, in particular philosophy, made this turn. It turned away from theory to experiment and practice. And this had a huge impact. So instead of just talking about sort of disembodied ideas, people became very interested in how knowledge, meaning empirical facts themselves, were produced and constructed. This created, or it occurred at exactly the same time there was a huge fight in the field. So science studies is bringing together sociologists, historians, anthropologists, literary scholars, and philosophers, and trying to get them all in a room to create this new discipline. And it doesn't always go super well. One of the things that results from that is you get a huge fight between primarily philosophers and sociologists. Philosophers think that facts about the world are established by nature. Sociologists want to give a bigger role to culture. And as fights do, they don't find middle ground. Instead, they keep creating these polar opposites. So you get this nature-culture fight. Enter into that literary scholars who say it's neither nature nor culture, it's all discourse. And so now you get this third pole of discourse. And so as a poor graduate student, you're sitting there trying to figure out, do I join one of the sides, like the one my advisor's on? Or do I try to find some way to make everybody happy at the same time? Notice none of the historians enter into that fight. Because historians are they want to please everybody. They're the satisficers. And so my history advisors said things like, good history knows all that. And good history automatically deals with nature, culture, and discourse all at the same time. But they didn't tell us how to do that all at the same time. When I was at San Diego earning this degree, though, Bruno Latour was there. And so Bruno was my sociology professor. And in seminar, he would obsess about this problem, nature, culture, discourse. How are we going to figure out nature, culture, discourse? And so we always joke with him that he'd become a Trinitarian, right? That he had to somehow unify all of these things. Well, in the wake of that, a lot of philosophers and historians have been trying to figure out how you can say that science is simultaneously natural, cultural, and discursive. Because it is. And it's ridiculous to think that any of those things have priority. So the thing that I've lumped on, especially in this paper, is Hans-Georg Reinberger's way of talking about how the production of empirical facts or empirical knowledge, or what he would call epistemic things, is natural, cultural, and discursive all at the same time. And what Hans-Georg and a lot of other people like Fred Holmes have done is really focus our attention on how scientists interact with the world in a way to produce these marks or inscriptions that then lead to a chain of inscriptions, a la Latour, to produce representations of the world. So the chain of inscriptions, the actual marks that are produced at the beginning of this discursive process, the actual system that the scientist is part of and builds is natural and cultural at the same time. So it combines all of these kinds of things. The philosophers like this system because one of the things that it does is it doesn't allow for an anything goes kind of attitude. So philosophers in particular were really worried that if they agreed with sociologists, then it's all just power and authority and it's all gone to hell. And they're pretty sure that the world matters in some way. What Hans-Georg allows us to see is that of course the world matters, and that how it matters is that it constrains what you can do. So sometimes the fish and the flies and the moths that you're working on won't let you do certain things. Okay, they push back. They actually have agency in that process. That doesn't mean that they have agency independent of us, but they have that agency nonetheless. But it's agency within these constructed systems. And so what I did in this paper is really start with that as this ground level of science on the ground. And after 15 years in a biology department, this is really important. If you go over there and you live with them for a little while, you realize that this is the most important thing in their life. This is what they do every day, and is work on these experimental systems. They become very identified with these experimental systems. It's how they are understanding the world, and that's part of what I tried to convey in this paper, and especially to try to start with the idea that instead of looking at these people as from an institutional perspective, where we would automatically make Richard Goldschmidt, he was called the loving God of Dahlem. He's a very eminent person. Tatu Aida, not so much. They're very different people. But by starting with them as experimentalists, we kind of at least get to level the ground a little bit. Because these experimental systems are one of the sites with which they construct their epistemic authority. And so one of the things I wanted to do is to start out with more or less the same level of epistemic authority and then build on those other institutional and national structures and communications, the things that will change how we perceive their authority later. So I wanted to start with that sort of practical aspect of what they did, because that, to them, I still think is the most important thing. And you probably didn't do the back of the envelope math, but there's a little clue in here about how many flies, for instance, bridges would process a day. Anybody notice that part? It's about 2,000 a day, 7 days a week. And that's about normal. So that's about how many flies he would count and sort and then arrange for more matings. So it's it's an incredibly time-consuming, all-consuming kind of thing. But it's mostly what an experimentalist will do. So to me, I thought this was a very important part to center. Now, part of the paper is also making this distinction between experimenting and theorizing. It's not as clear-cut as that. Experiments are as theoretical as theories are. But I wanted to separate those activities of experimenting and then theorizing on top of the experimenting. So I'm not trying to say that experiments are atheoretical or anything like that. What I was trying to do is to look at different kinds of activities that these scientists would pursue, especially because theorizing had different values in different cultures and in different laboratory settings. Some institutions really valued theorizing, others definitely did not. In fact, you would kind of be hurt if you theorized too much. So that's another part that I wanted to emphasize as part of that process. It's a little bit long. I have ideas about what I want to cut out, like the entire section on biology and the social and the extension to humans. I think I would probably just drop that. So I imagine you will have other opinions. But Doug and Veronica want it 1,200 words shorter. So I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I started with my comment. At the end of the Science Institute, we are changing our perspective on the globalization of taxonomy with Michael's paper radically, I would say, in looking at the models of knowledge production on the example of experimentation design and its different effects. Michael provides a meticulous historiography on the research, on the search of the mechanisms of how to determine sex as a transnational competitive enterprise, oscillating between Germany, Denmark, Japan, and the US. In the first third of the 20th century, he shows the different approaches embedded in different national academic traditions of the comprehensivists and the pragmatics. Ludwig Fleck's approach of different styles of thinking may contribute to further understanding of the various schools. I agree with Michael's mode of distinguishing the styles of thought in a broader philosophical context leading the various experimentation to science. Michael's paper focuses on the German Jewish geneticist Richard Goldschmidt, who was extremely influential and very widely received in sexual science. The first part of the paper situates the genetic experimentation, as Michael pointed out, in the frame of Jörg Reinberger's convincing experimental system. However, Michael's description of Reinberger's contextualization seems to be somewhat too elaborate with respect to the orientation of the forthcoming volume. I would like to make some propositions that at times may be somewhat peripheral to Michael's paper, and in addition I would offer some ideas of condense some paragraphs which, however, may be rather the task of the editors. On a general level, I would ask why research on genetic sex determination became so important after the turn of the century. Not so much for scientific reasoning, but for gender politics. Following the paradigm of the French Revolution, freedom, equality and fraternity, even between men and women, the 19th century was inspired by the invention of sex differences. Identified by qualitative and quantitative research measurements in anthropology, anatomy, physiology, phrenology and psychology, hard facts such as skull size, brain weight, pelvis width, muscle mass has served as a starting point for deducing the natural inferiority of women and their limited capacities in thinking, feeling and acting, as well as their biological determined tasks as housewives and mothers. The debate resulted in that what Claudia Honecker calls the special anthropology of women, that makes womanhood as a distinguished polarized category of the human species and thus perpetuates the man's hegemony. This legitimacy of this mode of deduction, women's inferiority from physical macro traits, got increasingly questioned by scientists and women's rights activists. Consequently, they faded in its effects. At that time, around 1900, occurs a shift in research from macro into microstructures by biological and medical experts. Histological, genetical, and endocrinological research accompanied and reinforced the macro scientists' claims. Its results constitute an internal, invisible gender distinction, stabilizing the traditional gender hierarchy. The question of hermaphroditism and intersex discussed by Michael was most decisive in this respect. What I want to point out, the seemingly scientific ivory tower of geneticists fit into the gender debate and have intentionally or unintentionally far-reaching effects on gender policy at the time. My second point is a bit more specific and speculative. It aims at the question of race. Erwin Belz, a German physician, belongs to the first and most influential generation working at the Tokyo University to introduce Western medicine in Japanese earliest Meiji period. In Belz's view, like that of many other Europeans later on, Japanese people would belong to a so-called feminine race, which Japanese partly adopted, reformulated or rejected. Belz proposes, in order to masculinize Japanese people, to pair them with Europeans, especially Germans. My question aims at a possible analogy in racial imaginary when Goldschmidt was chosen as local subspecies of Humanitria japonica, to cross them with European subspecies to demonstrate sex-determining mechanisms. So a common but scientific arguing racial assumption could have influenced or even shaped Goldschmidt's experimental design. I want to add a footnote. Bell's assertion on Japanese race was so common that even Hirschfeld braced in his Geschlechtskunde the superior effects of human race mixtures on the example on German-Japanese marriages. Simultaneously to Goldschmidt's research on geographical variation of Humanitria japonica, the geographical distribution of different kinds of masculinity was widely discussed in anthropological literature. South Japanese men would be more masculine, successful fighters, inclined, as Benedict Friedlander proposes, to viral forms of homosexuality compared to the North Japanese man. Geography, gender imaginaries, and racial theories were at that time deeply interwoven. For instance, Paul Kammerer, the most prominent, last but tragic Austrian Lamarckist and co-worker of Eugen Steiner, undertook animal experiments on the correlation and effects of climate and masculinity at the same time. Goldschmidt published his very influential contribution on the analogy of genetic sex determination of moth and man, 1916. I think Michael has the special print with him, titled The Biological Foundation of Contrary Sexuality and Hermaphroditism in the Explicitly Racist and Eugenic-Orientated Archive of Race and Social Biology, founded and edited by Ernst Rödin, one of the most prominent anti-homosexual German psychiatrists and one of the influential Nazi eugenicists and race anthropologists later on. In 1904, when its first issue was published, Rödin integrated homosexuality in an article in the Eugenic Discourse, rejected any positive contribution of homosexuals could add to the society, and criticized Hirschfeld's demand to decriminalize homosexuality very harshly. So, when Goldschmidt submitted his paper to Rödin's journal, he was surely well aware of its strongly anti-homosexual attitude. Additionally, Goldschmidt proposes explicitly and concrete hormone therapies to cure homosexuals from its orientation. So I assume Goldschmidt tried to immunize himself to the suspicion of being homosexual friendly, which could be erased by his quoting of Hirschfeld as a central figure of its movement. As you mentioned, later in his life, Goldschmidt cancelled his assumption on the parallel modes of expression of intersexuality between animals and humans. But Hirschfeld insisted in ignorance of Goldschmidt's cancelling his authoritative claims on human intersexuality until the 1930s. Hirschfeld needed biological proofs on the naturalness of sexual diversity for its biobiological strategy to fight with the scientific argument against the criminalization of same-sex acts. So in 1923, Hirschfeld published a contribution, The Intersexual Constitution, in the Yearbook for Sexual Intermediates, introducing Goldschmidt's term of intersexuality into sexology. At the same time, he acquired a breed of Humanitria to continue Goldschmidt's research and one of guinea pigs to do endocrinological research in the Steiner tradition at his Institute for Sexual Science. Michael knows we talked a lot about the political instrumentalization of Goldschmidt's work of intersexuality after he emigrated to US. And maybe it would be worth to include it a little bit in the paper. Goldschmidt's theory was picked up by Theo Lang, who tried to prove it on the example of thousands of imprisoned homosexuals from Hamburg and Munich during the Nazi era, when he was looking, amongst others, on the race mixtures between Germans and Jews. Later on, another influential Jewish-German psychiatrist and pupil of Ernst Rüdin, Franz Kallmann, who immigrated to US, where he got a leading psychiatric geneticist, introduced Goldschmidt's ideas into the twin research on homosexuality in the 1950s. The third point. I see a challenging, but so in my opinion, not enough explicitly theorized level of your paper in the international networking of the included researchers. In our summer institute, we were until now very much focused on the idea that approaches on sex and gender are deeply embedded in, shaped by, and adapted to specific national conditions. But obviously, this model belongs to the nation-building era of the 19th century. Even in the early 20th century, it seems to be much more characterized by floating ideas around the world, from which Kurt gave us an example with the endocrinological research by Lipschitz yesterday, and which Michael points out in the case of the genetic sex determination on the example of Goldschmidt. Theories and researchers traveled from Europe to America to Asia, forth and back. They constituting a tense knowledge-producing, exchanging and disseminating network which needs a closer recognition. Which levels of institutionalized agencies and knowledge exchange are involved at that time? How and in which fields research networks are placed, and how did they interact on a more general level? And so I think it's maybe not worth to mention Bruno Latour's with his Actors Network approach, just to have a very fine tool to synthesize.
No, that was in the back of my head. Actin networks, because
Yes.
the organisms are also actins that
Yes.
are traveling.
Oh, I say Actors Network.
Actin.
Actin networks.
Yeah.
Fourth, and maybe it's a little bit weak, you are describing and comparing the research design and procedure of your protagonists, necessary, detailed, with its very essential for scientific historian essays. I would like to propose a more common explanation, helping readers who are not so familiar with your specific argumentation. Maybe in the process of rewriting, you could a little bit condense that part, and maybe it is worth to think about to put it a little bit more on a meta level of interpretation.
What do you mean? A meta level?
A meta level.
But what does that mean?
It means so in a more general mode. So.
Okay. I still don't know what that means. So, eliminate the detail?
No.
No.
No. It seems to me that so the language you are using needs a little bit more explanation. So this.
Okay. So this.
There are a couple of very,
It's jargony.
I would say, scientific historian terminology. People are not really so familiar with it. So it wasn't a problem for me, but it could be. That is could hinder readers from different research backgrounds to understand how you are arguing.
Right. That makes sense.
So that's it. Thank you.
Mike's paper offers us a trenchant account of the history of sex reversal research in genetics. In his deft handling of his material and his fluid movements between accounts of biological science and their epistemological significance, Mike accomplishes what many historians of medicine, and I count myself here, hanker after, an interdisciplinary account of influential scientific developments and analysis of the sociological and intellectual factors that were brought to bear in the lives and careers of key thinkers in the fields of genetics. This is fused with in-depth understanding of their methodologies and the nature and meaning of their scientific contributions. As a trained biologist, Mike is equipped with this knowledge, and as a philosopher, he is also attuned to the nuances of rhetoric and fact construction. Once this particular research project has concluded, I would therefore like to suggest that Mike tackle other subjects that seem as intimidating but are as worthy of socio-historical investigation, problematization, and analysis as the genetics of sex reversal. So I have taken the liberty of designing Mike's next book cover for him. Here's the original cover from his edited volume, The Educated Eye. And here is my cover draft, The Educated Liberal Artist. The text will be a critical guide to the construction of arcane scientific objects, and it could perhaps include string theory, protein folding, and molecular cloning among its foci. So my suggested title is The Educated Liberal Artist, Arcanity and Expertise in the Scientific Imaginary by Mike Dietrich, forthcoming circa 2016. So I'll circulate that perhaps. Humour aside, scientific literacy has played an essential role in enabling historical as well as present-centered critiques in the health and life sciences, including in relation to issues as diverse as fracking, responses to global pandemics of disease, the mania for scientific measurement that has attended the rise of the nation-state, including the gathering of biometric data by the US government, and of course, the global history of sexual science. In the case of this paper, Mike's familiarity with the history of biology helps to incorporate, quite literally, the presence of animals in scientific research about sex. This is important to bear in mind when, or if, we decide to grapple with the etymology of sexual science and sexology and furnish a definition which encompasses our various projects, and we spoke about this a bit yesterday. One broad question for Mike to address, therefore, is what is the role of animal research in the global enterprise of sexual science? Thus far, my commentary has taken a more holistic approach in analysing Mike's paper in cheeky pursuit of what Mike, after Jonathan Harwood, has termed a comprehensive style of scientific thought. From here on, however, I'd like to follow the pragmatic approach, detailing the ways in which the paper could be revised so as to fit more snugly and in print with the other papers presented over the course of the Institute. I'm also taking analytical inspiration from my fellows in the Institute and hoping to invoke their expertise in approaching this research through the framework of science studies. And with Angie's explicit permission, I would like to term this the Wellesian analytical approach. 1. Mike starts with Aida and the Medaka fish, but I think he should instead start with the historical construction of intersexed humans. And I see Raina's points kind of tying in here. What is needed here is background information on the theory of intersexuality in science. In essence, how science constructed intersexuality among humans as well as other animals at the chronological start of this research. Later on in the paper on page 22, Mike writes of the analogy between experiments in gypsy moths and humans. Some introductory remarks about this would help to situate your readers more firmly within the biological complexities and along the historical continuum of this debate. Perhaps Mike should consider focusing on 2 rather than 4 of the scientists mentioned here. The work of Goldschmidt received the most attention, and it seems as though he is the central figure here. I suggest that the focus of the paper be honed in on Goldschmidt and other figures brought into the story on the basis of their engagements with this work. I think the paper becomes a little diffuse at points as attention is divided between all of these scientists and their contributions. Mike makes a tantalizing reference on page 5 to, quote, broader social issues regarding sex, sexuality, and eugenics. And Raina has really picked this up. I think this needs to be explored further here and over the course of the paper. Similarly, the mention of Eugen Steinach, is that how we say it? Research on page 7 bears further explication, perhaps in a section that establishes the key scientific debates about intersexuality and homosexuality at this time. So I'm really echoing Heine's requests. The inclusion of subtitles and connecting sentences would do much to link up and streamline the different sections of the paper. On the top of page 10, for instance, a heading about shifts in scientific thought would have been helpful. Here I would like to raise the spectre of another figure who has been haunting our discussions over the course of the Institute, but who I think has yet to be mentioned outright, and that is Thomas Kuhn, who, in keeping with the Institute's parlance, I would like to term Commissar K. The ways in which the work of these four researchers function to challenge the paradigm of genetic research could perhaps be explored productively using both Kuhn's theories and the Popperian critique thereof. Here are some terms that require explication, and I think Heine was requesting, he was trying to sort of mention which of these could perhaps be unpacked further, and I've made a list of them. General theory of sex determination, balanced theory of sex determination, time law of intersexuality, static genetics, species imperialism, and sexual integration. On page 18, Mike writes, the idea of conforming to the Drosophila system denied other empirical realities and was laden with both species and national imperialism. Mike explains this further in his punchy conclusion, but I would like further explication here as well. Mike gestures towards Goldschmidt's background and his identity politics at various times over the course of the paper. On page 21, he mentions his forced migration from Berlin to Berkeley, and on page 22, he speaks of how he was motivated by, quote, more than just science. These are signaling towards his more detailed account of Goldschmidt's national affiliations and their influence on his career, but I think this needs to be brought forward so as to anchor the readers more firmly. On page 22, when you provide details of Goldschmidt's connection between intersexuality in moths and humans, my Wallesian alarm bells are ringing. Could you perhaps reflect more on anthropomorphism and its implications in this research? You write of Goldschmidt's argument that 50% of homosexuals came from, quote, healthy families, but don't qualify here whether this is whether there's a psychiatric basis for health or disease, and whether this was defined in biological or psychological terms determined by the sexual scientists whose research you're invoking. You allude to eugenics and theories of racial hierarchy on page 23 when writing about, quote, the interbreeding of different geographic races and, quote, unions between Bavarians and German nobility. But there's no explicit reference to racial theorists, and I think Heine has mentioned a few of the key theorists whose work could be incorporated or perhaps mentioned here, as it was undoubtedly influential. The panic about miscegenation that was gaining ground in countless global locales is also implicit here. Perhaps it needs to be foregrounded more explicitly, especially as you go on to mention the, quote, idea that geographic variability and intermixing were the roots of human sexual aberrations. In your account of Goldschmidt's theory of intersexuality, you are pointing to the invocation of science as a means of normalizing homosexuality, or more modestly perhaps, discounting claims of homosexuality as a voluntary perversion through the construction of its innate biological basis. And here I discern the influence of Darwin, but I think you would know more about this than I would. Of course, so would Heine. You're also exploring the momentum garnered by sexology as a credentialed science at this time, supplementing what were essentially ethnographies and anecdotal litanies, which form the basis of key sexological treatises. This is one of the outstanding contributions of this paper in relation to the overarching themes of the Institute, the fusion of different forms of scientific specialization and their interdisciplinarity within sexual science. And as an added-on question here, would you like to take the chance in your answer session to reflect further on whether you think these theorists may be aptly characterized as sexual scientists, or whether you eschew this term in relation to them altogether? On page 24, you mention the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Biology. As a medical historian, my immediate association was with the cabal of research institutes, including the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, Human Heredity and Eugenics, which housed researchers including Eugen Fischer, Ottmar von Verscheur, and Joseph Mengele. Of course, I'm wary of falling into Godwin's trap of comparing all to Nazism, but is there a historical connection to be drawn between the research cultures of these institutes? You write that Goldschmidt broke with Hirschfeld and abandoned his views of homosexuality as a form of intersexuality, but it's not clear exactly why he did this. Was it because he lacked a sound evidential basis for these claims? Why this focus on genetics as the preeminent journal? This is clearly bound up in the emergence of the US as the global scientific superpower, and is a good opportunity to flesh out the significance of genetics as a growing discipline within the global scientific sphere. Relating to this issue of national contexts, in your conclusion you write of how national and institutional contexts and histories contributed to styles of thought with very different attitudes towards theorizing. How and why? You relate differences in national scientific culture to Goldschmidt's application of his research to humans. Can you elaborate more on this? Lastly, I enjoyed the inclusion of images here, which helped me to visualize the difficult biological concepts that Mike outlined here, and I would like to thank him again for this boundary-spanning work.